we go deeper into contact work, it becomes much more than just about contacting ETs. It really has a lot to do with the evolution of consciousness and the evolution of your planet. We cannot separate the two. The process that consciousness takes from the experience of separation to the experience of reintegration. Coincidentally, it's the same process that happens during the contact experience. Simply, when you live a human life, your life seems continuous and solid. But if you start meditating or you start spiritual practices, you'll start to notice that the quality of reality changes. Your consciousness expands, and you begin to travel to another realm in your consciousness.
Ever wonder if there's intelligent life elsewhere in the universe? Well, I have. I've been wondering since I was a kid. My name is Reuben Langdon, and on March 29th, 2007, in the middle of the day, I saw a number of strange objects in the sky. Coincidentally, I was working on the film Avatar at the time, playing an alien. And ever since then, I've been on a quest to find out if aliens really do exist, and if so, are they here, with us? If beings of higher intelligence are here, what is their purpose? Why don't they make themselves more known? Why the secrecy? I've asked these questions to many experts, yet each seems to have a different theory. So I thought to myself, why not ask the aliens directly? So that's what I set out to do. Well, sort of.
All right, hello to you. This is Sasha.
Hi, Sasha.
Nice to see you today.
Nice to see you. Thanks for being here and being part of this big adventure show that I got going on.
It is our pleasure.
First, I'd like to sort of ask, what density do you reside in?
We are within what you would call the higher levels of fourth density.
Oh.
So we still have physical bodies.
Okay.
But we know that our planet and our people is on our way to making the transition to no longer having bodies.
So almost, well, my understanding, and I could be wrong, but sixth density would be more losing the body sense, but on the fourth density as well?
In the scale that we use, which is 7 densities,
right.
The fourth density is the last density in which physicality is expressed as a separate body.
Okay.
As you begin moving into fifth density, then you become more plasmic in nature.
I see.
So you could kind of say light beings.
Okay.
But as you go farther and farther, deeper and deeper into fifth density, then it becomes less individualized and you start moving more toward collective.
Would our dream states be a fifth density reality? What density would you classify the dreams in?
Well, this is a metaphor that we've used in the past for another project. We're going to resurrect it here because it's very useful.
Mm-hmm.
If you consider the idea of a golden lake to be your state of oneness in complete integration, the state of sleep is the time when, in a sense, you revisit or reconnect with that state of oneness. So we wouldn't say that it is necessarily a separate density. The dream state is another expression of consciousness as you are reconnecting with your true nature.
I see. So it's not even, it's almost in its own classification.
Exactly.
Sort of like angelic realms. Well, angelic realms I've heard are borderline somewhere around 6th, 7th, 8th density sort of thing. But do they have a classification?
Well, based on what you're saying, it seems we're using different scales.
Yes. Okay.
So obviously the answers are going to be a little bit confusing. For us, it's a seven density scale.
Okay.
So we consider the angelic realm to be more 6th density.
Okay. All right. Yeah, this is good because I having again this scale or base to ask questions from and sort of go back and forth. It helps the audience sort of put the pieces of the puzzle together, formulate their own ideas.
Yes.
Because a lot of the same, sometimes we use same terminologies, but like we just noticed that it might be just slightly a little bit different.
Yes.
Yeah.
If we can say just a little bit more about density, just to give a broader perspective for those who are listening. The best way to describe our version of the communications about density is to liken it to the idea of a rainbow. So when you have the original white light that then passes through a prism and becomes a rainbow, those 7 light frequencies that you see are kind of representative of the idea of the densities of consciousness. But if you look at them very closely, a rainbow, for instance, there's not a sharp division between each one.
Right.
There's a gradation.
Correct. Yes.
So consciousness thus moves from its original state of oneness through the fragmentation and through series of different types of expression. The densest being, 3rd density, which is where humanity is leaving from because it's egoic based.
Okay.
And then you begin moving out of that ego-based reality and back into the collective.
I've also, wonderful analogy. Most of the analogies I've heard is sort of related to the chakra system, which again is related to the rainbow. So it's,
exactly.
it sort of goes full circle.
Exactly.
So, I've heard that our plant and animal kingdom are 2nd density consciousness.
Yes.
As we are moving into 4th density, and we're sort of in that blending of the rainbow phase, I would say early phase. Where are our animals, are they blending into the 3rd density?
Okay. There are 2 ways to look at this idea. One is a linear way, and one is a holographic way. Okay, so if you are to look at it from the perspective of linearity, which is what humans are more familiar with, then what you would see is that the other species and the other consciousness around you is moving also. So from the linear perspective, you're going to find that the species on your world that you might consider the higher 2nd density species, such as the primates and certain bird species, etc., they are too making a transition to 3rd density, which means then the development of ego. So you're starting to see, even in dogs and certain animals, more symptoms of ego. Ego, of course, not meaning a negative thing. Ego is simply a mechanism that grounds you in the experience of separation for a higher purpose. Okay, so in that sense, then that's the linear perspective. Now, if you're to look at the holographic principle of this idea, we're going to, again, we have to speak in metaphors.
Yes.
We're going to ask you to imagine 7 rooms that nest inside each other like boxes, like those Japanese boxes, yes?
Okay, right.
And the bigger box that contains the smaller boxes would be more representative of 7th density.
Okay.
Okay, so from the holographic perspective, you exist in all of those boxes, thus in all of the densities. And it's simply a matter of perspective about the you that is choosing to notice the experience it's having at any given time. But it is all simultaneous. So in that sense, there's no movement linearly from one density to another. It's a complete expression, a complete experience on all levels simultaneously.
Right. I saw. Would that relate to, I guess, platonic solids or geometrical shapes?
Exactly. Yes.
Well, there's a great video I just saw online. Maybe I'll post it here in this video, where all of these platonic solids were inside each other.
Exactly.
And they sort of pull them apart.
Exactly. The platonic solids are a wonderful metaphor for the density energy and also for the evolution of consciousness as it moves from separation back into integration. There is one workshop we do where we actually equate each of the densities to different platonic solids.
Oh, perfect. Okay.
And it's the same idea, yes.
Oh, excellent. And would that mean then our first density minerals and rocks and these sorts of, is water, I guess, considered a first density being?
Yes. Yes.
Would that sort of move into the second density then and start having sentient consciousness?
Well, the thing about first density, again, we're challenged by the two perspectives, linear and holographic.
I guess what I'm saying is in a linear sense.
In a linear sense.
Yeah.
In a linear sense, we have to say that the first density consciousness is a little bit different.
Okay.
Because the first density consciousness being the first manifestation into the reality of separation is the building blocks of creation. So it's your periodic table of the elements. It's all that stuff of creation.
Right.
Now the higher forms then, like high first density, would be the mineral kingdom as an example.
Oh, I see. Okay.
And
okay. So
yes.
So just like with our for like you guys being on a higher end of the fourth density spectrum, so you still have physical bodies like us, craft that you probably fly around in, and where we're just now entering that phase, but we're still in that fourth density classification.
Yes. Okay. So it's a spectrum.
Right.
It's an entire spectrum. The difference you're going to see, because you humans are now entering the fourth density beginnings,
right,
and we're toward the end, the biggest difference you're going to see between the two of us is what we call the egoic anchor.
Okay.
So ours is not as heavy, so to speak.
From your time of evolution, if you can remember this or have records of this in your era, what was in relative years, Earth years, your linear evolution from beginnings of fourth density to where you are now?
Well, looking at it linearly, we went through very similar type of evolution that you are going through now. However, we would say that our challenges as a species were different than yours. So for us, a lot of our challenges had to do with self-forgiveness, guilt, things that we were holding on to as a young species that we then had to learn how to transcend. And for a very, very long period of time, those challenges for my species really stopped our evolution and almost destroyed us as a species. Because when you keep pushing down the emotional things that need to be explored, you can, well, our species created a plague, so to speak.
A plague, oh wow.
A plague, yes. Similar to what you might call an immune plague, where a disease within our immune systems was destroying us and we had no idea what it was. And we had to use our connections with, you might call them the angels or the guardians of our species, the guides of our species. We had to connect with them to find out what it was. And what we found out was that our pattern as a species was that we were refusing to look at and integrate what you call the shadow.
Okay.
So we were keeping that separation. And once we could learn to integrate the shadow and the light within us, this was a significant nexus point in our fourth density evolution, fourth density evolution. Once we were able to make that integration, then the plague healed itself and our consciousness began evolving.
Into fourth density.
Yes.
And was that a long time ago, or time-wise in a linear sense? Are you able to put a time stamp on that?
It's very difficult because, as you know, timelines don't line up.
Sure.
But it was long enough ago. If we were to pinpoint a time on your world, it would have been before late dinosaur time.
Okay, so we're talking thousands of years.
Millions
of
really,
years.
Yes.
In fourth density right now, since that evolution.
Well, again, the timelines don't line up.
Okay, right. Yeah, I understand.
It's really impossible to answer. Generally speaking, the evolution of a physical species does take a very, very long time. Now, it depends on the species. It depends on the genetic work that's been done on the species. It depends on what they're holding on to, what they're willing to let go of. So everyone's process is different.
Right. Through these interactions, I've learned that we all create our own realities. Is it possible for an individual to go into a timeline where the collective evolution of the species is accelerated if the individual is willing to do that work, so to say, and then and not bypass the collective, but go into a timeline where that collective evolution is super fast?
Well, that's really the only way to change timelines. It's not, as you said, it's not a matter of bypassing. It's more a matter of resonance.
Right. Okay.
So we've given, we believe you've heard it on tape, we've given a little bit of what we call the quantum map, which talks about how the reality stream or the time stream is very similar to like the blinking of eyes. You don't notice your eyes are blinking all day, but that is how the physical universe continues to express itself, is through bursts. And each time, it's like an in-breath and an out-breath. So each time there's an in-breath, which is like the blinking of an eye, you realign with a new frequency structure. And that's how you, in a sense, jump timelines. We do have to say, though, that the ego cannot direct this at all.
Right.
So
it's a releasing of the ego in order to do that.
Exactly.
Right. So it's not, and consciously, there's almost it's almost, you can't do it consciously, because the ego is part of this conscious mental mind, where we're trying to guide, where we're trying to steer the ship, and you have to sort of let go of the steering wheel to get there.
Exactly. The ego has very significant needs.
Right.
And it will always, let's say, default to those needs before it will default to the evolution of consciousness, because then it dies, so to speak. Yes.
It's almost like going to the mountain and doing the hard training, and then, after all the hard training, you realize that to get to this enlightened state, there's no training necessary.
Exactly, my dear. Exactly.
Excellent. So I kind of want to go back to the Pleiades in your star system now. We have this definition of the Pleiades.
Yes.
Of, is it the six sisters, seven sisters?
Seven sisters,
Seven
yes.
sisters. And there's obviously, because if you look through a microscope or a telescope, you could see a lot more stars than just the 7 stars that we see.
We realized we did take a tangent
Yeah.
off into something else from what you were asking. Basically speaking, we're actually going to jump back and answer the part of this question and the other question that you had before. Basically speaking, the beings that you know of as Pleiadians are not indigenous to the area that you know of as Pleiades. All right, so we have basically 2 genetic lines. One comes from the ancient Lyra, and one comes from the ancient Lyra combined with Earth genetics. That's another story, perhaps for another time. So there's 2 different lines that eventually colonized in the area that you know of as Pleiades. So not really the 7 sisters. However, in the ancient days, when my people would visit your people on Earth and we would be asked, where are we from? Well, if we pointed to those 7 stars in that direction, they got the point.
I see.
Now, the idea of humanity being a mixture, well, of course, it's no surprise to you that you know that there is a genetic connection between us.
Yes.
And it comes from many, many different sources, some of which is the Lyran, the original Lyran template DNA, and Pleiadians evolving from that, and then also working with the genetics on Earth. But we find this idea of simply looking at it genetically to be extremely limiting, because nobody is indigenous to anywhere. You are originally one. So again, we have to use metaphor.
Yes.
If you take holographic film, and the nature of holographic film is that if we were to take a picture of an apple and then cut up the film in tiny pieces, each tiny little piece would have the complete image of the apple. And it doesn't matter how small you cut those pieces.
Right.
So consciousness is fractal in that way.
Yes.
And therefore, no matter if you are a lowly human, so to speak, on Earth here at this time, you are fractally and holographically every other piece as well.
Correct.
So in that sense, then, the question is difficult to answer because our default setting is not linear.
Right.
And yet language is linear.
So you mean the Pleiadian, where you are in your evolution
Yes.
is not linear, correct?
Yes.
And in our human play system, our human OS is sort of in a linear sense. So
Yes.
we're trying to match those.
Yes, but you're really
ideas.
shifting.
Yeah. My understanding is that the Pleiadian is a very feminine energy. Is that correct? Or is it a very balanced in that sense? I always perceived or felt more feminine energy, archetypal energy related to the Pleiadian energy.
Yes. Well, what you're going to find with, again, not a simple answer to the question, what you're going to find with my species, as well as many of the other core species in your galactic family, is that there's generally 3 eras of development. The first era is more of the infant species. And it is in that first era where the issues, let's say, of each species that need to be healed come up. All right? And then the second era tends to be the healing period. When the integration starts, the healing happens. The third era, which is, of course, the mature era, is when awakening as a species happens. So my species particularly is felt as feminine in all 3 eras, which is really interesting. And it's kind of rare because many of the other species are more felt masculine.
Okay.
But the reason we are felt more feminine in all 3 eras is because as follows. First era, we already told you that the tendency for my species was to not want to look at the shadow. So we were kind of floating around in the spiritual bubble.
Right.
All right, which is actually an unbalanced feminine energy. Okay, then when you go to the second era and the integration happens, integration or the active integration by its very nature is feminine because it's inclusive. So all of that integration was creating a movement inward, which is a very feminine energy. And then, of course, in the third era, which is the awakened era, you have a species that is very balanced male-female energy, that is in an awakened state, and to a separated consciousness on Earth, that state feels very feminine.
So that's why myself and other people get the feminine.
Exactly.
And this is going into some other races, but I was told that my understanding is that the Anunnaki were a hybrid race of Pleiadian and Draconian energies. Do you see it from that perspective?
No, we're going to be a little bit of a rebel here.
Sure.
Because the word Anunnaki in your Sumerian language, as far as we understand the definition, means those who have come down.
Okay.
So Anunnaki is meaning basically those who came from the heavens.
Okay.
So they were not one species.
I see.
They were many.
I see. Oh, okay. That clears up a lot of stuff. A lot of questions I had.
Yes.
So that is interesting. We were trying to figure out, where did the Anunnaki get all this DNA? The old story of making humans for slaves.
Yes.
And
that was
gold.
only one particular family that did that.
Okay.
But as you know, they are the ones that get the bad rap, yes?
Right.
The rotten apple spoils the bunch.
I see. So speaking of DNA, and when that race of beings or that family took all these various DNAs from different star systems and created the human structure, how did that work in the beginning, or was there there had to be an agreement of sorts, or otherwise it wouldn't have happened?
Of course, there's always an agreement.
Yeah.
However, again, we have to say that we have to look at it from a non-human perspective. Now, you're quite familiar with other channeled information and such, talking about basically if something is happening or something is arising, there must be a higher purpose. And that is not in any way meant to be a cop-out, all right? It's simply the way the universe works. There is no mistakes in creation. Yeah. Now, in those ancient days, we have to say that your Earth or your solar system could be likened to what you call the wild, wild west.
Yeah.
Okay.
Feels like that today still, but
well, yes, it is. It is, but it's a little bit more colonized now.
Sure.
So it was an isolated place, and because of that isolation, a lot went on that was very fragmented, with groups, one group having one agenda, one group having another agenda, and conflicts and things such as that, all because these forefathers of yours were very young species. This doesn't happen with older species, only with younger ones.
I see. So you sort of answered the question earlier that yes, there was some sort of higher purpose, and therefore these other races sort of lend their DNA for this higher purpose.
Yes.
It wasn't stolen or taken and put, I'm going to go drug the Arcturian and grab some DNA or some mojo.
Yes, that makes a wonderful science fiction movie, but it's not quite the way things work.
Sure.
One of the things that we've said to many people sometimes that ask questions about this is that from the perspective outside of the Earth, or from a fourth density perspective, let's say, this idea of the sharing of DNA and the shaping of cultures using DNA is actually a very natural process. It's kind of like pollination on your world. And when you look at it, when you remove the victim-perpetrator idea, which is really only applicable in a very polarized third-density reality, then the whole paradigm changes, actually.
Right.
But the question then is, why? Why do people have these experiences of being a victim and things such as that.
Sure.
Why do those buttons get pushed? Well, when you are a third density species, in a sense you can say there are many passages, spiritual passages, that you have to go through in order to evolve your consciousness on the way to fourth density. One of those passages has to do with the healing of the clinging to the idea of victim and perpetrator. And many civilizations get stuck there for millennia. And so when you have, well, we're bringing in another tangent here,
No, that's fine.
but when you have the situation with the Zetas and the so-called abductions, it triggered the same issues. Humanity has been playing out for so many thousands of years, but this time from space. Are there victims? Are there perpetrators? And on the individual level of those who were claiming abduction, the reason it's happening is because they have to pass through that gate in order to shift their consciousness and integrate the polarity within themselves. And then on a collective level, it happens on a collective level as well, that changing of the paradigm. And therefore, a passage into fourth density can be made, or one of the steps of the passage.
So without the Zeta abduction, temporary detainment experience, then we wouldn't even have the opportunity to heal that wound, to move into fourth density.
Exactly, or you would have recreated something else.
Some other
basically.
scenario.
Yes.
Yeah, we would have. But at least we got to have it in that way so we could connect to our cosmic family.
Exactly.
As opposed to, making another story on Earth.
Yes, because in the Orion civilization, they didn't create the healing of that through the ET contact. They created it through a domineering empire.
Right, and that was the Orion Wars.
Yes.
Was the Pleiadian, your society, involved in those wars?
Shamefully, yes. We're making a joke.
Right.
Now, again, those conflicts lasted for a very, very long time. So there was a period of time when my species was very young. That our mindset was kind of like a teenager in your human counting. You know, gung-ho, do this, jump in without thinking of the consequences.
Right.
And so we did that, and as you say in your vernacular, got our asses kicked. And that brought up the issues of the guilt and all that kind of stuff that we had to work on as a species in order to make our shift. So in that way, there's nothing extraneous.
So now, obviously, that period of time is over, and hopefully the Orion, and we say now, and obviously time, and I guess, I'm just where you are with your evolution, you've cleared that up. You've been through that. You've had this. We have the story of the Orion Wars to tell, so we can heal.
Yes.
So future generations can say, "Hey, we've been there. We've done that."
Yes. And there are some residuals finishing up on your world as well.
Right, with the Orion Wars.
Yes.
Okay, and because again, so I've heard this analogy that everything that's happening on Earth is sort of the micro and the macro.
Yes.
So, if we go back just 20 years maybe in our timeline, then the Orion Wars were still happening, kind of in a way, depending on which timeline we're in, I guess.
It really depends on what you are connecting with energetically.
Right, and so that instead of looking at it from a linear sense, the vibrational frequency of where we're at, if we're vibrating at that frequency, then yes, the Orion Wars are still happening.
Exactly.
Okay.
For instance, people in your world who live in the Middle East, who are embroiled in extreme polarity and extreme control, are directly connecting still to that era of Orion.
Right.
Whereas perhaps you in your daily life are not.
Correct. I see. So instead of seeing time linearly in that sense, it's just more of a vibrational frequency.
Yes, and it's very fluid.
Right. And so if we can sort of see time in our daily lives too, and if we can see everything as a vibrational frequency, then maybe we could navigate through this frequency soup, I like to call it, a little bit easier.
Yes. Yeah. You're in a very, as you well know, you're in a very interesting time right now because, in a sense, you have 1 foot in third density, 1 foot in fourth. You're taking the foot out of third density, but because it's a spectrum and there's a gradation as the energy changes, you're still going to have challenges with the old way of doing things as the new structures are arising. Right. So this is really the most tenuous time and also the most challenging one.
Right. But also the most
exciting.
Exciting because the shift, the daily shifts are happening at such an exponential rate that we really can take notice.
Yes.
And see these changes.
Yes.
And that's exciting.
Exactly.
That's exciting.
Yes, it is. It's exciting for us to watch too.
Right. Exactly. We were having this conversation with Lyssa and Ron earlier about we call it the Mandela effect is the internet terminology for what seems to be from one perspective, a shifting of timelines.
Yes.
And it's almost now been labeled, now we have a collective name for it. And we're seeing pieces in our history shifting from the way we remember it.
Yes.
And we're going back and reviewing movies and tangible physical things that the way we remembered them, they weren't that way before.
Yes.
Is this the actual shifting of timelines?
It is as we were just talking about a moment ago, time is more fluid.
Right.
When you are rooted, let's say, in third density, time feels and is perceived as being more fixed. But now you're moving more into a fluid sense of time. And that means then that you are, again, it's a metaphor, it's the limit of the language.
Sure.
You're spending more time in the quantum state of consciousness where all possibilities exist.
Right.
And you are thus able to, remember we were talking about the blinking in and out or the in and out breath. You're able to shift the timelines much more rapidly, but in the past when you did it, you didn't remember the previous one. But now, as you are spending more time in the quantum, you're becoming more familiar and comfortable with that energy, that you're starting to remember the other parallels. Not in a schizophrenic way, but in a way that's meant to just that's meant to just show you.
Right.
Look how fluid you are becoming. You are unlocking.
And that's where the excitement,
Yes. So now you're beginning to see that the future, you've always seen the future is fluid, but now you're seeing the past is fluid too.
Exactly. And we can rewrite the story if we want to.
Yes, but the ego can never rewrite anything.
The ego, yes.
Yes, yes, the ego.
Interesting.
This is where people who do manifestation work get stuck.
Yes.
Because the ego takes over the show.
I can see that. I can absolutely see that. So we want to rewrite the story, but we can't really rewrite the story. We just have to, we can't rewrite the past story, but we can rewrite the now story with our choices.
Yes, you can rewrite the now story. Now, when we talk about now, we're talking about now.
Right.
And now. And now. We're not talking about 1 second from now.
Sure.
All right? So the only thing then that you have in the now is your experience of the now.
Right.
So therefore, what you are really rewriting is your experience of the now,
right,
which really has to do with your interpretation of the now.
And that, depending on that interpretation, will set us on a specific vibrational frequency.
Exactly.
And then depending on that vibrational frequency, we see the past rewrite itself.
Exactly. So if your interpretation of the now is one of victimization,
sure,
guess what you're going to get?
You're going to get a past history of Zetas abducting you every night against your will.
Yes.
And if you are at a vibrational frequency of non-victimization empowerment, then you're going to be going on the ships and donating your stuff instead of actually being taken against your will.
Yes. And even getting out of the ET stuff, even we're talking about, is your boss picking on you at work? Sure. So we're even talking about the human stuff here.
Right, right. And then shifting that perspective, shifting that now moment, now all of a sudden your boss is not picking on you, but got a greater plan, or something,
Exactly.
some other story. Yeah.
And this brings in the whole other aspect of the emotional body, because the ego, the insidious ego, we say that with love because the ego is simply a neutral mechanism, but the insidious ego will continue its dialogue with you that will tell you, well, if you're not shifting this now, you're not very spiritual. You're bad, you're failing. And that just further entrenches the anchor of the ego.
So it's just a big lesson of allowance and acceptance, and just being, really, and not the knee-jerk reactions.
Exactly, and watching yourself so that you can see your habits and patterns, and that's the key to your freedom.
And by embracing those emotions when they come, as opposed to pushing them away.
Exactly.
Okay. Now, I've heard different stories on the Zeta race. I've heard in one scenario that the Zetas have died off, that they, they created the hybrid races, they couldn't continue to reproduce, so they eventually died off. And I've heard other stories now that the Zetas are continuing their evolution because of their interaction with humans. They've actually activated their emotional bodies and are thriving quite well. And I don't know if they're back to reproducing, but at least they're on that path. And I'm assuming there's two different timelines that these are happening. How does this work?
Well, as with any species, if there is an aspect of the species that refuses to change, that portion of it will die off.
Okay.
All right. But as we were talking about before regarding the 3 eras of most of the physical species that you're connected with, the Zetas also have their 3 eras. So the first era was the era of their species crisis. And when they weren't able to reproduce and the emotional body was cut off, etc. The second era started to take place as the interactions with humans began. And all through the interaction period, for their species, it meant the reintegration with the emotional body through the work with humans, but also through the creation of the hybrid species, because, and you know the whole story, the drama about learning to nurture them and things such as that.
Correct, yes.
And all of those challenges they had in the second era helped their integration process. Then the third era Zeta, we would call the awakened ones. So this is a very, very high level Zeta consciousness that, in talking about parallel timelines, in the 80s and the 90s, very few people on Earth were tapping into that third level Zeta consciousness because people were still processing the more polarized victim consciousness.
Correct.
But we would say really beginning 5 to 10 years ago on Earth, many of you are now starting to tap into the third era Zeta consciousness when they have awakened. So their emotional bodies, mental bodies, all of that came into alignment and integration. And they've become like an elder race that is very, acting very much as mentors for younger species now.
Wow. How does that all work, I guess? To put it in a linear, and again, this is our linear minds trying to figure this out, because we have very advanced future versions of the Sasani Bashar coming in and talking to us, the Yael, we have other channelers bringing in different beings from the Yael civilization. I'm assuming that they look up to their Zeta, that third tier of the Zetas that we were just talking about, that they're interacting with them on that level.
Yes.
Probably
like grandfathers.
Right, grandfathers, because I'm sure their vibrational frequency is at that higher level, so in their reality, in their timeline, they still exist.
Yes.
They didn't die off.
Yes.
And yet we're humans in this level, and how does that interaction? I don't know. Could you go into depth a little bit about that?
My goodness, we're not sure exactly, because there's so many tangents we could go off at. Is there a specific curiosity? And we can start there.
It has to do with time, in the sense that we have these different aspects of the Ayel and the Sasani and even the Zetas coming back at this particular time, that version of them, why not, and even the version of yourself, why not an earlier version of the Pleiadian?
All right.
And then we have higher density dimensional collectives of the Pleiadians also visiting us.
Yes. Well, it's back to what we were talking about earlier regarding frequency compatibility.
Okay.
And also what you're calling in to push you to move to another level.
Okay.
So you have one aspect that is the challenge aspect that pushes you, and you have another aspect that is more of a mentorship level.
I see.
Okay, so for instance, you on your world, you have some UFO lore, if you wish to call it that, from the 60s or 70s, the Billy Meyer Pleiadian contacts,
yes, yeah.
all right? And so sometimes people ask, Sasha, do you know Semyasi?
Okay.
Well, from my perspective, my time, she is a past figure.
Okay.
Long gone.
Right.
Not in physical body anymore. But in your time stream in the 70s, you were pulling in those Pleiadian contacts because that's what you needed.
I see.
Now you're pulling in different types of Pleiadian contacts because that's what you need as well. So the Essassani especially, and the hybrid species are playing a very important role that has to do with alchemy. What do we mean by that? Well, the idea of alchemy is the bringing together of two seemingly conflicting ideas that create a response when they come together to create a third idea.
Right.
And this is, let's say, energy dynamics 101 in terms of species evolution. So whenever you get to a planet that is moving from third to fourth density, they are going to have to integrate the mental and emotional bodies, and they do so through a form of alchemy. So the Essassani, in a sense, are the alchemists, or the representations of successful alchemy.
Okay.
And you see it through the combination of Zeta and human, but also through what they actually integrated, which is the mental and emotional bodies.
And I've heard Bashar speak that the Sasani are closely related to the Sirius energy.
Yes.
And
in terms of Bashar, you will find that the flow of energy for the Essassani evolution moves toward a higher non-physical Sirian vibration for its future selves. So you find that there's a lot of future incarnations that move from the Essassani to the Sirian. Okay. And we would call that third era Sirian beings, again, the awakened ones.
I see. And humanity, it seems like we're in a crossroads right now because we have so many directions we can go with our evolution.
Yes.
We can go towards the Sirian direction of evolution. We can go towards the Pleiadian direction. We can even go towards the Draconian way of evolution. And in specific timelines, we are doing it all simultaneously.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And it's really up to us individually to see which one we want to be a part of.
So we go back then to what we were talking about a few moments ago, about because the ego cannot control the trajectory, all you have is the current moment. So in the current moment, your trajectory becomes clear. So this is some work Lyssa and Jermaine and myself have been doing with those, with using the galactic cards to help bring the focus with people to what is happening for them in this moment now. And let's say it's an emotional pattern that's more anchored in past Pleiadian, or an emotional pattern that's more anchored in past Zeta. Then these become icons almost, or archetypal stories that can help you move through in this moment now, whatever your challenge is, and it ripples through time in both directions. Because ultimately, again, going back to the 7 rooms, 7 concentric circles, you are the one and your fragments are inside the one. So you're never really outside of anything, and everything is you anyway.